Hello, everyone. It's 11 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Robin Bauer-Kilgo. I'm Special Projects Manager with the Florida Association of Museum. I want to welcome and thank you all for joining us for today's webinar on digitization. A couple things before we start. As you might see on your computer, all the attendees, all of you guys as attendees are muted. If for some reason your microphone is on, I'm going to ask for you guys to turn it off. It does look like everyone's muted, so that's a good start. We do that mainly because we just don't want a lot of sound interference happening in the background during the actual webinar. We are recording this webinar, so heads up on that as well. Hopefully we'll have this guy up online in about a week. And lastly, you will have a chance to ask questions. You all have access to a question box on your screen. So if you have a question for our presenter, feel free to type it in the box. You can type it in throughout the webinar, and we'll have a period at the end of it where I'll go ahead and kind of queue the questions up and ask our speaker as we're going. So as we get started, as I said, a full recording is going to be available of our webinar. You might notice that we have a YouTube channel. If you type in Florida Association of Museums into YouTube, you will see a bunch of our webinars plus part of the program I'm going to talk about in a little bit on what we're doing down here in Florida. This is our project team. I'm myself up at the top. My name is Robin Bauer-Kilgo. I'm the Special Projects Manager at FAM. Melinda Horton, she's the Executive Director of the Florida Association of Museums, and our Project Associate, Laura Nemmers, who's up in Gainesville. Melinda's in Tallahassee, and I'm actually down in the Florida Keys. So we are all over Florida, so it makes this quite a wonderful organization to work with. Today's speaker is John Nevers, Associate Chair of Special and Area Studies Collection at the University of Florida, the George A. Smathers Library. I'm really happy to have him with us. He's run quite a few digitization projects, so hopefully he'll be able to answer some questions and give us some good tips on some standards and how you might run a project at your institution. For today's program, we're doing the first part right now. We're doing a brief intro and overview of our Florida Connecting to Collections program, and then we'll jump right into the webinar. Quick note about our program. We are a partnership program, actually. We are an IMLS-supported grant. The grant's actually going to be ending in November, too. We've been running it up down here in Florida for about 5 years between two different grants. We're a partnership between us, the Florida Association of Museums, as well as the Society of Florida Archivists, the Florida Department of State, Florida Public Archaeology Network, FASA, which is the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, Florida Library Association, and the Florida Art Museum Directors Association. So we really tried to make this program a partnership between all these different organizations that deal with collections and collections management. As I said, we've been running this program for quite a while down here in Florida. Our most recent incarnation of the completed program was our Developing Emergency Plans program. This is actually available on our website. The web address is listed below. I know that we have quite a few people on the line today who are from Florida and have taken part in this program, but we also have some newbies and some people from around the country. So we wanted to let people know that this program is available as a resource. The first one was done on emergency plans. We broke it up into 8 modules. Which are basically the sections of an emergency plan. We have webinars, activities, discussion questions, practical activities, samples, and online resources. So if you're in the process of doing an emergency plan or you want to update a section of your emergency plan, this website is here for you to use. Through our 2015 program, we actually assisted 77 participants across the state. We had 13 mentors and 64 mentees. As you can see here in Florida, we are a long, narrow state. So we actually had a pretty good smattering of people across the state take part in it, which was pretty important to us, especially when we're dealing with emergency plans. Emergency plans are important. We have hurricanes, we have wildfires, we have flooding. So that was something that we really wanted to cover here in Florida and was important. But now, and as I continue kind of just describing our program, we're actually in the middle of a program dealing with collections policies. So right now, we are more than 3/4 of the way through the program. What we've done for the entire program is basically we break things up into modules. We have 2 workshops per module. Workshop 1 is usually held at a larger organization. That one deals with an emphasis on webinars, in-person discussions, groups, and building our mentors, mentees together. Workshop 2 is held at a mentee organization where they participate in an in-place assessment, which is what we call the collections care enhancement involving boards. Basically, after the assessment, we write a report that then can be sent to the board. So it's kind of like a mini map or a mini CAP if anyone has been through that process. We also do a practical activity based upon subjects covered in the workshop workshop. So, and we'll talk about this at the end of today's webinar when I talk about some upcoming dates. But this actual workshop we have coming up on June 23rd, we're going to be doing a labeling activity. During the emergency program, we actually did water and salvage practicals. So it was a really good way for people to get hands-on opportunities. Like I was saying, while we do our program, the mentees write policies with advice with mentors. Like I said, we basically have 4 modules with 2 workshops each. Mentees have homework before and between the workshops to move their plan forward. Mentors are also asked to touch base with mentees between the workshops, and we all participate in an online community, which is this quick screenshot of it. The online community is a really good way for people just to kind of get in touch during the actual periods of the workshop. As you saw on that previous map, we have a very large state. So it's a nice way to have an online platform, which is password protected and safe for people to talk about these kind of topics. And lastly, we have, again, our YouTube channel. I'm going to, again, stress everyone to go ahead and take a look at it. We have a lot of good content on there. So I'm going to say if you're interested in any of these subjects, be it emergency planning or collections policies, feel free to take a look at our webinars. They range anywhere from 35 minutes to about an hour long. So feel free to enjoy them while you can. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and switch our presenter over. So if everyone will just give me one quick second. And as I'm doing that, I'm going to reintroduce John. John works up at University of Florida. And for this webinar, we basically asked our community of current participants for Florida Associate of the Connecting to Collections program, what little subject would they like to hear about that kind of deals with collections policies. They'd like to do like a 30-minute long or 30 to 45-minute long webinar on just something that you deal with that maybe we can't cover in our main program. And we decided on digitization. And as I said, John is an expert or very, very knowledgeable in this subject. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the mic over to him.
Thank you, Robin. I appreciate that. Okay, I switched the presenter view. Are you seeing my slide okay?
Everything looks perfect.
Perfect. Fantastic. Let's get started. Good morning, everyone. As Robin said, I have a lot of experience working with digital projects, but I just wanted to mention up front before we dive in that most of my experience is coming from the library archives world. I have a little bit of knowledge and experience working with more museum type objects and artifacts, and I can, if there are questions about that at the end, we can certainly talk about that. But I just wanted to give you the perspective is going to be mostly coming from you have a photograph or a document or a book or something like that, and you want it scanned. Just wanted to put the slides in that context for you before we get going. So digitization, why do we do it? The main 2 reasons are you want to enable access. You want people to be able to discover your materials if you're putting them online, or even if you're not putting them online, you want them to be more accessible. And also we do it for preservation. And those 2 things often go hand in hand. If you're going to be scanning for discovery and access, you might as well be scanning for preservation is the one way that people tend to think about it. But certainly you can have reasons where you scan for just one of those purposes. The best example of that is something that can be scanned for preservation, but it has copyright restrictions. So therefore you can't put it online for discovery and access. But often what you want is you want to be doing both at the same time, making it accessible, making an object also preserved. You're preserving the original while you're scanning. So we're going to be talking today mostly about planning and the standards and best practices that you want to follow. But in doing so, you have to think about some things like what are the workflows you're going to have? What kind of access are you going to have? You know, are you just going to allow access for somebody who's, you know, in your shop looking at this on your computer, you know, on a computer in your reading room, for example, or is this going to be online? Who's going to be using it? Are these internal users, the general public, anybody who finds it? What's your primary audience? And then, of course, what resources do you have at your disposal, or should you seek for projects? All of that gets wrapped up in this idea of planning, and we'll talk about each one of those a little bit more. So the next couple of slides are just a laundry list of questions that I ask and others ask when they're doing a digitization project, whether it be a few items or you know, thousands of items. Who's going to participate in the scanning project? So for me here at the University of Florida, when I ask that question, I inevitably answer, well, it's the people who have the subject expertise or the format expertise. It's the digital folks. It's the preservation folks. Maybe it's maybe our IT department. So you need to ask the question of, what's this expanding network of people that might be involved, or is it just one person sitting at a scanner scanning things? Um, what you want to digitize is very important. It's easy to say we're going to digitize everything, but the reality is that that's often not practical or desirable. And most digital shops will tell you that it's much better to be selective at what you digitize and make sure you're using your time effectively and efficiently. So you want to say, why are not what are we digitizing, but also why are we digitizing? What's the purpose? This gets back to that idea of access and preservation. A good example of why we digitize would be we have materials that we know have a lot of research value or education value or whatever it might be, and they're not being used. So let's put some samples online, a representative sample online, and see if we can hook people to discover these items. There are many other reasons. You have a donor you need to appease. You have you're tying it into some kind of educational activity or an anniversary or something like. There's so many reasons why digitize, but it's important to actually think about that up front. It's something where you should go through the process of saying this is why it's important to digitize. Then you get into the nitty gritty. Those are kind of like the high upper level, like why are we doing it? Who's doing it? What are we doing? But then you start getting into some more specific questions. So are there copyright issues? Are there privacy issues? There's other issues that you could be involved with, classified documents if you're working with government papers or government documents. Anything that might have sensitive information in it, do those issues exist and you're going to have to resolve them before you digitize something? What's the existing arrangement description of the materials? Are you going to have to arrange and describe things before you scan them? Because if you did it afterwards, you might have to make description up as you go. That would add cost to the digitization activity. Or if you digitize and then you rearrange a collection, are you losing some context there? And does the digital version no longer make as much sense because it doesn't match the physical? Speaking of physical, what are the physical condition of the materials you're scanning? Do they need preservation or conservation work? Can they be scanned? That's a fundamental question you have to ask is, will these documents survive being placed on a scanner or even being handled to take shots with an overhead camera, for example? What steps are involved in digitization? And you want to be, when you're planning, you want to be very specific. We often here at UF, we will chart out or sometimes draw it out, documents move from processing area to preservation to digitization back to the curator. And so we'll actually map that out to see where there are any points where we have to make adjustments in our workflow. What standards we use, and we're going to be talking about standards a lot more, so I'm not going to talk too much about it right here, but the main message is there are standards and you should use standards, and I'll come back to that. Here's a big one. How do you preserve the digital resources? Again, it's fairly easy to scan. Scanning equipment is cheap. Scanning software is relatively cheap. It's pretty easy to scan. The really expensive part comes when you ask, how do we sustain these digital objects we've created and the metadata, the descriptive information and technical information that goes along with them over decades, over the life of your institution and the need for these resources. How do you preserve those digital resources going forward? How do you migrate them to new technologies? That's an entire different webinar. There are plenty of webinars on that topic. I'm not going to go into that too much, but it's a huge question you should ask up front. Again, I mentioned this earlier, but how do you provide access? That could involve selecting and installing and purchasing a discovery system, some kind of digital library system, or if you have a open source one that you have to get training on to run yourself, or if you're paying somebody. It could be, again, like I said earlier, it could be just having these materials scanned and you're providing access to somebody in your reading room, and that's more straightforward and probably less expensive. What's your timeline? The important thing here is that when we're planning projects here at UF, we have a pretty good idea, because we've done a lot of scanning, of how long it's going to take to do something. So I can very accurately say, well, this is my timeline. This is how long this project will take. Um, People who are just coming to this new, it's a little bit more difficult to say, I know it's going to take me 3 months to do X thousand pages of scanning. But as best you can, you do want to be able to plan appropriately, because if you have a volunteer, for example, who can devote 3 months to a project, but it's a 6-month project, you need to know before you go into it that you're not going to get your scanning done because that person is going to leave, in 3 months. So timing is something where I think you learn as you go, and certainly what I would recommend, and I'll get back to this later, is reach out to people who have done a lot of scanning if you're just starting. Find out what some estimates on time are in terms of this is how much per page or per book or whatever it might be. What resources are needed, and I've talked about a lot of these already. And then how are you going to pay for the costs associated with your project? So there are lots of resources for you to use. If you Google or Bing or whatever your search engine is, if you Google, planning digitization or digital projects, you're going to hit a lot of resources fairly quickly, and actually it can be a little overwhelming. There's some good resources that we're presenting here. Some of these you will notice from the dates are 15, almost 20 years old. Don't take that as a sign of they're out of date. The reality is that although hardware and software has improved a little bit in the last 15 years, the actual best practices and guidelines that have been promulgated in the scanning era, they've pretty much stayed the same. The standards keep getting refined and improved, but the reality is if you go back to the Cornell tutorial there at the top, it's still very good entry level. This is what you do when you want to digitize. So I would recommend looking at these, and don't be worried about the date or the age of these items. Here's a couple of others. The FADGI or FADGI, I've heard it pronounced different ways, but that Federal Agency Digital Guidelines Initiative, that's a pretty good one. I look at that fairly regularly. These are all good resources, but that's one that in particular, they have a couple of working groups, one on still images, and maybe the other is moving images. I forget off the top of my head what the second is, but I go to the still images group quite a bit because they're always putting out new information. So those are some resources you should look at. So this is the way I look at planning, and I think this has been true in my experience. About 1/3 of your effort when you're planning for digitization is actually the planning and the preparing for, and then all of the stuff that comes with overseeing the project, and then what happens after the project. So wrap that up into planning and administration. Maybe that's everything you need to do to get the items scanned, and then to make sure that they were scanned right. That is administrative work. It's not as fun as getting the thing scanned, but it's worth knowing up front you're going to spend a lot of time doing that. The larger the project, the more of that you need to do. 1/3 of your effort is also, that's all related to technology in terms of metadata, in terms of OCR, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but that's optical character recognition. If you have a text document and you make an image of it, you can make the text searchable by running it through an OCR engine, and I'll come back to that. File management, again, if you're using a digital system of any kind of digital library, 1/3 of your effort is going to be wrapped up in that. Metadata alone can, depending on how fully you're describing these materials, could eat up so much of your labor on any digitization project. And then the last third is just the actual imaging of the materials. And so some people go into digitization projects mistakenly thinking that they can just put some things on a scanner and scan it, and that's the end. And The reality is if you're doing digitization right, if you're planning it right, then you have a model that looks more like this. So we talked earlier about access. I just wanted to drill down into that a little bit more because that really is fundamentally what a lot of digitization projects are all about. I don't want to diminish preservation. It's an important part of what we do. Preservation, though, is much simpler, in my opinion, because you're scanning materials, you're imaging materials to a particular standard, and you're saving those materials. That's relatively straightforward to do. You do have to worry about migration in the long term, trustworthiness of what you've scanned. I'm not oversimplifying that, but access makes it much thornier because then you deal with issues of, as I say here on the slide, public or restricted access. Are these materials that anybody can have access to, or is it selected people? Best example of that is we have materials here at the University of Florida where records of the university, and they're restricted to public use. The only people who can use them are staff of the university in particular offices. We can't put those materials online. They're desirable as materials to be scanned, but the access dictates that it can't be online. So we need to know that up front. Once you also know how you're going to make the materials accessible, then you can answer questions about what resolutions do we need to have our images scanned at? How are these going to be delivered? When we're delivering them, are we delivering them directly to a patron, like in a reading room? Are we delivering them through a library system? So I give the example here of, you can scan a photograph, for example, and for preservation quality, let's say you want to scan that at a resolution of 600 dots per inch or pixels per inch, which is what the PPI stands for there. But that's not a good resolution to put online. That's a very large file. It's more than most people need. There are other reasons why you wouldn't want to put a large, uncompressed, master scanned image online. So what you do for accessibility is you have a compressed, which means lower resolution. It's not a master file, it's a derivative file. And it's a JPEG format, which means you might lose information because it is compressed as opposed to a TIFF format, TIFF, which is a typical preservation quality format if you're not compressing your data and your image. So here's a typical workflow that we follow. This kind of summarizes a little bit some of these questions we asked a few slides ago, but this is it in a nutshell for our planning around here in terms of the steps. We typically have a selection process and reviewing to see if there are any rights or if there are any privacy concerns. And that's primarily done by our curators, collection managers, archivists. We then have pre-scanning, pre-imaging prep work that we do. That can be anything from removing staples and rubber bands, if those exist, to flattening materials if something is very curled and we have to have our preservation librarian flatten it, to metadata creation, which is all of the descriptive information that we might need to create if it doesn't already exist. We have the digitization as a step in the workflow, and that's producing a master image, master file of some kind, plus any derivatives. So if we have a master TIFF image as our master, and then we have a JPEG as our accessibility version, and then we have a GIF or a GIF, some people pronounce, for our thumbnail image, for example. Those are common derivative files that are produced. OCR, as I mentioned earlier, optical character recognition. This is fairly standard if you're scanning text-based material, that you will want to run it through an OCR text conversion, because if you don't, you just have a photo of your document. You can't actually search the text. What OCR does is the OCR engine goes through and it says, well, these bits, these dark places all on this document all look like the letter E. I'm going to say it's the letter E, and it goes to the document really quickly, trying to recognize text, and then it spits out what it thinks is the text on that page. If you've ever used Adobe Acrobat, it has a built-in OCR engine, and you can actually go in and say, okay, I have a document that I want you to recognize the text in. That's something that most people are familiar with. The results of OCRing can be quite good. They can be quite bad too. So it depends on the quality of the original image. If you have an old document that's faded and or if something is handwritten, the OCR doesn't work at all. It's pretty much has to be typewritten and pretty clean. Quality control, next step, that's after scanning. Are you correcting your images? Are you de-skewing images? So if something is turned 3 degrees to the left, do you straighten it? Do you crop? Those kind of things. Making sure the right images match up with the right metadata and linking those two things together. Or if you're using some kind of digital management system, how are you linking your metadata to a particular image? This doesn't have to be done in a system. It can be done another way, but usually in the QC process is when that happens. Providing access, again, as I said in the last slide, this is where you're providing access to your derivative files and how you're doing it. And then how are you preserving your master files? Are these being preserved on, locally on external hard drives or on a server? Are your masters being preserved by sending copies to a shared preservation operation? Like here in Florida, we have the Florida Digital Archive, FDA, and there are other preservation solutions you can use. But what are we doing with those masters is another step in our workflow. I'm not going to get into technical stuff too much, but I've already thrown out several technical terms. And before we talk about standard, I just wanted to give you a heads up of some of the things you're going to run into. There's just no other way to do scanning properly, digitization properly, and not talk about some of these things. Bit depth and color space. And I'll show an example of that in the next slide. Resolution, which, as I said, is pixels per inch or dots per inch. You'll hear those terms used fairly interchangeably. The higher the number of pixels that you can get in an inch, the better the resolution and the better fidelity to the original. So if something is scanned at 600 DPI or PPI, it's better than something scanned at 200 PPI. To give you an example, that's a common example that's used, 600 is usually publication quality. So if you scan something for 600, you can turn around and you can publish it in a book. Something like 72 or 96 DPI or PPI is what you find on the web often. They're not high quality, large images. File types, you have to know a little bit about what types of files. I've mentioned TIFFs and JPEGs, and there are lots of other file types. Image compression. Compression is basically when you save a file, you're either saving every single bit, every single computer bit that exists about that file, and that means it's uncompressed, that you're just saving everything, and it's a faithful representation of the original. Compression is a way to make your file size smaller. So the way a JPEG is a much smaller size than a TIFF is because they compress things. What the software does is it says, well, we've got a bunch of bits of data here that look pretty much the same. It's all gray or it's all blue. And so let's just compress this down a bit and save less information here. Well, that's fine for creating accessible versions, but it is low quality. You are losing information when you compress a file. OCR I've mentioned. There's all kind of hardware considerations in terms of what type of scanners you're using or what type of cameras you're using. And then, of course, the same is true for hardware and software that you would need for accessibility. So you're going to encounter all of these as you look at standards. I wanted to give you a couple of quick examples of why this is important to look at the standards and best practices and pay attention to these technical considerations. One is the quality and fidelity. There is a trade-off between quality and fidelity to the original versus the file size. So you can see there fairly readily that the bitonal, which is just black and white, you lose a lot of information when you compare that to the grayscale, and then with the full 24-bit color scan over on the right. There's quite a bit of information there's a lot of noise that comes in on the bitonal, and so the upside is that if you scan at a high resolution, like 600, for example, and you have a good bit depth of 24 bits, and you're scanning in color, great. You have a nice, faithful, high quality representation of your original. The downside is that image could be many, many megs. That one single page could be many megabytes of data. And if you're scanning an entire book, you suddenly are talking gigabytes. And if you have multiple books, you're into terabytes eventually. And so there is a trade-off between the bit depth, the resolution, the file size. Resolution also affects OCRing. Really look at the first column and the last column on this. The middle two don't change too much, but you can see the difference between the first top left image is scanned at 75 ppi, and you can see the quality is not that great of the text in the image. And then below that are the OCR results, and you can see it just totally, other than the L's, it messed up everything basically. As you move over to 600 on the right, you see that you get a very faithful text output from the original. It has no trouble reading the original text in the image and identifying it as those words. And as a matter of fact, for this document, 150 and 300 ppi worked quite well. All right, so I just wanted to give you a quick, dip your toes into some of those technical terms, because you are going, if you've never looked at any of these standards and guidelines we're going to talk about next, it can be a little horrifying at first, because some of them immediately start throwing these charts at you and graphs and all of these scales. And, if you're not a technical person, or even if you're not a technical person who has much experience with imaging and Photoshop and that kind of thing, it can be daunting. So first of all, standards, use them. There's a reason why they're there, and they're called standards and best practices. It's because people have been doing this for quite a while now, and the community, the digitization community, has a pretty good idea of what works and doesn't work. And there's a reason why you should follow standards and best practices. You don't want to reinvent anything. There's many different types of standards and best practices. There are ones particular to digitization. There are standards that are particular to metadata, and within that, there are many standards just related to descriptive metadata, which describes the objects, technical metadata, which might be about the file format and the resolution and all of the technical aspects of the objects, authority metadata, which might be about the creators of the object that's being described, rights metadata. There's plenty of others, and each of these has their own standard. And then, of course, there are a ton of standards relating to preservation. Let's see here. This slide and the next couple of slides, there's some guidelines. The one I provided at the bottom here is from Lyrasis, and it's just like a toolbox that points you to other standards and guidelines. And one of the reasons I put this here was that they group things into various categories quite nicely, so you can go in and just look at standards for preservation, for example. What you want to adopt are standards that they're open, they're well documented. You see people are using them. You can go out and you can Google a standard and you see that, okay, all of these institutions around the world are using it. It's based on standard and character encoding. It's not encrypted. It's not compressed. This all makes sense to you when you start looking at these standards more. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that, but the important thing is that you don't want a standard just because somebody has labeled it a standard doesn't mean that it's a best practice because people haven't been applying it widely. I'd look for a standard that people have been using, and it's tried and true. I mean, true and tried. A couple of other examples, there's file format recommendations from the CDL, California Digital Library. Here's an example of what I was talking about. Here are some, this is the FADG, however that's pronounced. Still image working group in 2010 put out some wonderful guidelines, technical guidelines, but they are technical guidelines. So when you get in and look at them, it is a bunch of, 3,000 pixels across, 27 pixels by 20, it's, you really get into it. So I just wanted to point out that be prepared. I've mentioned rights management a couple of times. This is an important part of planning for any digitization. You have to know that you can scan these materials and make them accessible. You have the rights to do so. There are some examples from ARL, the Association of Research Libraries, and OCLC on how to put materials online when you do or don't know what rights are associated with those. And particularly the OCLC document at the bottom there is pretty good about the latter case where you're not sure if you're putting things online that are protected or not by copyright. Always look for collaboration partnerships if it makes sense for you. To me, I can't imagine doing some of the projects that we've done here without collaboration. You get so much from working with other people. You can pool resources. You can go seek grants together, and you have a better competitive edge for getting a grant with a partner than you do alone. It certainly can improve everything you're doing in terms of workflow and products. It's a two-way street, so it can improve your partner as well. It does require, however, a lot of coordination and communication. So you're not just, getting married to a partner and everything is rosy. It's just like a marriage. You're communicating. It's an important part of the strong relationship. Outsourcing. I'm not going to talk about this too much, but this is a fundamental discussion that you should have when you're planning your digitization. If you have a large project, at a certain point, it might become cost effective to look for somebody to do this project for you. Or if you have a project of complexity, let's say you're scanning something that's three-dimensional and you can't do that in-house, who can do it for you? Or you may have staff, you may have a scanner, but you don't have the ability to do OCRing, for example. So for those reasons, you might look at the fact that there are vendors out there who do this all the time. They do it at high volumes, and so sometimes their costs can be much lower than costs in-house, which could have high startup costs. One downside is that if you aren't doing it in-house, you're not gaining any expertise or infrastructure in-house to do it in an ongoing basis. So in some ways, maybe you make an investment up front and scan, figure out how to do all of the things yourself. And then it might cost you more in the long run, but you've got the in-house expertise and the infrastructure to do it moving forward. You also have a security risk if you send things out of your facility and the things are out of your control. The things can be damaged in transit, lost, stolen. So there are security risks. And then, of course, it's not easy to select a vendor because there are a ton of them out there. One of my best recommendations when we're looking, one of the things that we always do when we're looking at a vendor is we go look for recommendations from other people who have used the vendors. And many of the vendors, if you go to a website, they will say, here are people who have used our services, or you can ask the rep for the vendor for information like that. And then we'll just go ask them and say, what kind of quality did you get? How was the responsiveness? Ask all of the questions that you'll need to ask as part of your planning process, and make sure before you engage a vendor that it's somebody that you can trust with your materials and your digitization workflow. All right, so that was a very high level, quick and dirty view of digitization planning and standards. I can't stress enough that you want to plan, no matter how small the project is, you should plan it out ahead of time. You save yourself so much grief if you think about things before rather than after. Again, it's not just putting things on a scanner or taking a picture. There's so much more involved. And so you want to make sure that you're not assuming that something can be done for a very low cost or in a short amount of time because you haven't thought out all of the other factors that relate to digitization that aren't related to actual scanning. Go look at those standards and best practices. Do ask other people for advice and tips. I know routinely we're contacted here at UF because we have a very large digitization program here, and we've been doing it for as long as anybody. We're contacted regularly for questions about what hardware should we use, what vendor should we use, what software, and so on and so forth. So ask. There are people out there who all around the state who have been doing scanning for quite a long time, and they're happy to share their information.
That was great.
All
Thanks,
right.
John.
Thank you.
That I think that's one of the big things. Like, you first brought up at the beginning kind of the idea of you work for libraries. I predominantly work with museums, but a lot, like pretty much the stuff that I've always been asked to digitize is photographs and books and like stuff that you probably would see in a library. Every once in a while, there will be a digitization of, like a 3D object of some kind or a project based upon that. But I think we predominantly still live in the world of library and archives. You know what I mean when it comes to digitization projects, just because they're easier to digitize in the grand scheme of things. So it's good to hear kind of the standards and stuff that you all are looking at. Well, I'm going to go ahead and ask if anyone has any questions. Feel free to put them in the chat box now or in the question box. I'll keep an eye on that while I keep chatting to John a little bit. There's not anything in there right now, but we'll give you a few minutes in case someone does have questions. Another thing that I found just kind of interesting is that you're right, this is like a huge topic. And we kind of knew going into it that, we wouldn't be able to cover all of digitization in 30 to 45 minutes. That's pretty much impossible. But we thought at least we could give folks a good groundwork on kind of maybe things to look at or resources to look at. That would be incredibly important for just kind of a starting place. And the fact of don't be shy to ask questions. We have experts, obviously, in our state in Florida. There's places around the country that have done large scale digitization questions. And regardless of the size of your institution, I've never had a case where I've kind of walked in being like, help me. And they've never been like, no, we will not help you because you're a small institution of one. They'll always sit there and talk to you or, just discuss with you maybe some of the problems that you're having or some things that they've done some workarounds on. So that's always an important thing. We do have a couple questions that just popped in. So I'm going to go ahead and look at these. Okay, our first question is, are there any work groups or specific resources you recommend for smaller organizations wanting to begin digitizing their archives? Can you recommend any off the top of your head, John?
That's a great question. I might have to think about that. So a lot of the professional associations will have sections, roundtables, working groups that work on digital objects, digitization, and those are always a good place to start because the topics they're discussing in their sessions and their newsletters, they tend to be pointing people to new resources. So I think off the top of my head, I would suggest go to one of those first. If you're in the museum community, I'm sure that AAM and FAM and organizations like that have somebody talking about digital groups. Digital activities. I know that's true in the Society of American Archivists and Association of Research Libraries, ACRL, and all these other library associations. I know that there are groups specifically talking about digitization. There are also some digitization specific organizations. Oh boy, I'm drawing a blank on the federation's name. I'll have to think about it. There's some specific groups that's all of these groups are formed to do is to talk about digitization, digital matters, and it's a long laundry list, but there are a few who DLF, Digital Library Federation, I think is what it stands for. I'll check that right now. But that's the best I can do off the top of my head. Robin, did you have any others that you would add?
That's all I can think of. Those groups, I know, like, I think it's Library of Congress. Like, if you go into their website, you can go down a deep hole of just standards and that kind of thing. And they have some regional work groups that might be able to help you. I know in the Southeast, like, we have Lyrasis, which they do. You referenced them in your presentation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They've done a lot of digitization projects. So I think they're Southeast, right? So I think that they
are, yeah.
They are good people. And obviously, there's groups like MCN, which is the Museum Computing Network, which is one of the AAM groups. They do a bunch of digitization stuff. Um, I think it's one of those deals where you either kind of like follow up on any of those groups, Google the name, or even talk to like in your case, John, you work for a larger university, so even talking to the folks in the university or the state archives or any of them, saying, "Hey, do you guys know of any local groups?" They might have heads up on some groups to work with as well, just because they're a little bit more on the ground for those types of things. We did have another question pop up, and it's a good question. It says, "Hello, is it possible for you to share John's slides with us?" Yes, I think we can arrange that. We'll have the webinar up, and when we do that, I'll try to throw the slides up on a link as well, so all our attendees will be able to access them as well. I was going to go ahead and see if anyone has any other questions we might have for John or anything I might be able to chime up on. As I'm waiting to see if anyone else has anything else to type, I think the other thing you kind of have to think on with these projects, or at least what I think of, is I'll often have people call in or call me and be like, "We need to digitize stuff. How should we do it?" And I'll always be like, "What are you using it for?" Like that's kind of my first question to
Yeah,
them.
right.
um, I, I, in the perfect world, I'd be like, get the highest quality you can get, because then you're kind of not having to deal with redigitizing in the long run.
Hmm.
But if it's someone saying we just need a couple images for a publication or we're putting stuff on the web, that's kind of usually my starting place for it, is trying to figure out, okay, what's the output type going to be? And then you kind of run from there on what you should do to digitize it and how you should digitize it. I mean, obviously, like I said, the highest quality that you can get would be great. But I also know sometimes you either don't have time to do that or you don't have the resources to do that. So that's usually a big question to ask as well. So looks like we don't have any other questions coming in. So I'm going to say thanks again to our speaker, John. Thank you so much. That was a great overview on just how people can kind of attack this very daunting subject.
Happy to do it, Robin. I just wanted to add, I did look up Digital Library Federation. I did come up with that at the last second, so I was right, and that was one group you could look at. I also wanted to mention that in answer to the first question, also a lot of the regional library networks like Tampa Bay Library Consortium and Cephlin and Nephlin. If you're familiar with these, if you're in the library and archives community, you've probably heard of these, maybe even in the museum community. I know that they've done museum focused workshops and discussions in the past. A lot of those regional networks, they have regular training on digitization activities. So look into those. Northeast Federation, Northeast Florida Library Information Network is the one that we're a part of here in the Northeast part of the state. So that's another resource that I would add.
Yeah, and there's Sweflin too, which is Southwest
Yeah,
Florida Library.
right.
And I'm sure, and I know, like I said, we have listeners from outside of Florida on this. I'm like 75% sure there's going to be regional library
Sure.
consortiums in your part of the country as well. And that's one thing I think with this digital stuff, is that it moves so fast. Not so much the standards of the workflows, but just the types of digitization, that sometimes it's really nice to get hooked into a larger library that has, or group that has more
You just took the words
resources.
out of my mouth. That was the
So
second point I was going to make, which is, frankly, just find the biggest shop in your neighborhood and and go ask them for some help. I know we get that all the time from local repositories around North Central Florida, and I know my colleague at the University of Miami, Laura Capel, who actually is, I should thank her publicly for doing some of these slides. I worked off of the bones of her presentation, a previous presentation she had done for FAM. I know that down in Miami, for example, you could do a lot worse than going to University of Miami
yep.
or FIU, for example, and just asking them for some help. And I'm sure they'd be happy to talk to you a bit.
Yes, definitely. And I like FSU has some help too, the state archives in Tallahassee also.
Sure.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
everyone's very welcoming with their answers to questions. Let's just put it that way, in my opinion, when it comes to this subject. So great. Well, thank you again. So, and I'm going to do a couple
Happy to do
other
it.
quick things, and then we'll go ahead and release everyone. Just some couple quick reminders. This is our schedule, and I meant to put this earlier in the presentation, but this has been the collections policies Florida Connecting to Collections program that we've run through so far this year. We started all the way back in December of 2016, working through all the sections of a collections policy, either from the library standpoint or the museum standpoint. So you'll see all sorts of topics there. We are dead in the middle of Module 3, but we've actually gone through acquisitions and deaccessions and loans and all this kind of fun stuff, and inventories and audits. So eventually, all these subjects will be part of a website, kind of like what you saw of the emergency plan website that showed up earlier in the presentation. So look for this probably in like December-ish timeframe. Everything will be up and available. And for those of you in Florida, while we're just kind of in the midst of our Module 3 right now, we're doing digitization is the one we decided on. And we have our next workshop on June 23rd, which is going to be held at 3 locations throughout the state: the Ruth Funk Center over in Melbourne, Old Capitol in Tallahassee, and down at the Wolfsonian. We have one more module that you can actually sign up for free if you are in Florida. The workshops, that series will begin on August 4th. We'll probably open up enrollment in July. I'll throw out lots of emails about it. If you take part in the program, you can kind of do like a mini review of what should have been in your policies, and we will help to see maybe you get set up with either a new policy or the beginning of a new policy. So just please do keep that in mind. And for one last shout out for FAM, we have our annual conference coming up in Naples, September 17th to 20th. I do social media as well, so I always have to do our shout out of hashtag FAM 2017. It should be a great conference. We're at the Ritz-Carlton Resort, Golf Resort in Naples. It'll be very nice. We just did a site visit there about a week ago, and it was a great facility. And the Naples community opened their arms to us, so there's going to be great afternoon activities planned and evening tours of all the great Naples institutions. So enrollment, or rather registration for that conference, is going to be open soon. So if you're interested in coming, feel free to either contact myself or go to the FAM website at flamuseums.org. Thank you again, John, for taking some time today. If anyone has questions for our program, feel free to email me at robin@flamuseums.org. Thanks so much for joining us, and I hope you guys have a great summer.